Good morning to everyone in the United States. Good afternoon to Europe, and hello and welcome around the world to this seminar, which is titled "Fresh Start or False Dawn." My name is Jeff Rathke. I'm the president of the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies at Johns Hopkins University. And today's event stands out in my mind for a few reasons. It's the last public event that AICGS is going to host in 2021. So we look back on an extremely busy year and take inspiration from all that we've been able to do. But more importantly, this is such a timely seminar because it is focused on the prospects and pitfalls of transatlantic cooperation, especially between the United States and Germany under the newly formed government led by Chancellor Olaf Scholz. Olaf Scholz is in Brussels these days for his first meeting as head of government with his European Union counterparts. And when you look at the items on the agenda, you see very few that don't have a strong transatlantic component, whether it is the situation regarding Russia and around Ukraine, the relationship with China, and a whole host of other important issues. And that's why I'm so pleased that we have today as the sixth and final presentation in our series by visiting fellows at AICGS, Kai Oppermann. Kai is a professor of international politics at the Chemnitz University of Technology. He has previously held positions in the UK and in Germany. His research focuses on the sources of European integration and also on foreign policy, with a special focus on transatlantic relations and British and German foreign policy. Kai has been with us for the last couple of months and has been doing research into the transatlantic and the German-American relationship, and I'm very eager to hear his views and the results of his research. So I will get out of the way now and turn the floor over to him. But let me just make one housekeeping note. We will be using the Q&A function in Zoom today. So for all of our viewers out there, if you would like to contribute to the discussion, please use the Q&A function, and please make your contribution in the form of a question and make it as concise as you can, which will allow me better to organize them and get to as much of the audience participation as we can. So with that, Kai, it's good to have you with us, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jeff, for this introduction, and many thanks to everybody at AICGS for hosting me. And I'm especially grateful to Susanne Dieper for all her very kind support. And I should, of course, also thank the DAAD for funding my fellowship. Now, the objective of my research was, as Jeff has alluded to, was to explore the Biden administration's thinking about US-German relations, in particular with the new coalition government in Berlin now in office, and to map out areas of convergence and divergence between Washington and Berlin on important issues on the transatlantic agenda. I believe this mapping exercise comes at a critical time when the pieces in US-German relations seem to be in flux. On one side, the Biden administration, less than a year in office, but we have already seen that this is an administration that reaches out to Germany, that is sending strong signals that it wishes closer US-German cooperation. And on the other side, the traffic light coalition in Germany, after 16 years of Angela Merkel. And while nobody expects a radical shift in Germany's international orientation, there is certainly scope for a change in emphasis and direction. All of which suggests that this is a time when the foundations for the relationship in the coming years are being negotiated, which is why I believe that understanding how the Biden administration approaches its relations with the new German government gives important pointers to how US-German relations will play out in the coming years. Now, in my research, I've explored the Biden administration's priorities in this relationship through a series of more than 20 interviews here in DC with a range of experts across the political spectrum, in major think tanks, staffers in Congress, academics, the German political foundations here in DC. And I'm really grateful to my interviewees for being so generous with their time and expertise. One caveat is really important, and that is that my interviewees did, of course, not agree on everything all of the time. So I had to weigh what I heard, and what I will present is really my judgment on the overall gist that came out of the interviews. Now, let me start with a couple of general observations before I go through four main issue areas that came up during the interviews, which are China, Russia, German leadership in Europe, and NATO. The most general observation is that the Biden administration views foreign policy and US-German relations very much through the prism of domestic politics. This is an administration that sees itself in a struggle for the future of American democracy, that defines its mission as preventing a return of Trumpism in 2024, and that is under great pressure to deliver domestic results and quickly, with the window of opportunity potentially closing at the midterms in 2022. Foreign policy is deeply entwined with this domestic agenda and has therefore been described as unusually results-driven, at times at the neglect of process, as can be seen perhaps in how the Afghanistan withdrawal and the AUKUS agreement have been handled. Now, this domestic politics focus is best epitomized by the slogan of a foreign policy for the middle class that leaves perhaps the clearest marks in the field of trade policy, which also serves to show how the domestic focus of the Biden administration can lead to transatlantic friction going forward, in that some in Germany and Europe detect protectionism in the slogan, although my interviewees were united in the view that Biden's trade policy is not driven by protectionist instincts, but rather by this domestic imperative to make trade policy work domestically. So my first point really is that the prospects for US-German relations in the coming years cannot be understood without seeing Biden's very tight domestic room for maneuver. The Biden team will want to see returns on its outreach to Germany and Europe. It expects the new German government to fully engage with its agenda, rather than hedge against the risk that the Biden administration might lose re-election in 2024. And the danger is that this is not fully understood in Germany, that people are quick to criticize the Biden administration without perhaps accounting for these domestic constraints, all of which is complicated by the fact that the new German government, of course, has domestic politics too, and that it will be on a steep learning curve during its first term year in office, which raises the concern that the window of opportunity for closer US-German collaboration may close before significant progress has been made. My second general point is that Germany has quite a high profile in the Biden administration. Many interviewees have remarked how the Biden administration sees Europe through the lens of Germany, that it considers Germany as the dominant economic and political force in Europe. Other interviewees have emphasized the strong Germany expertise in the Biden administration, pointing to people like Amanda Sloat, Karen Donfrid, Julie Smith. In other words, Germany's voice will be heard in the Biden administration. And as some interviewees have suggested, Germany will unlikely see a US administration that is better disposed to Germany than the Biden administration. At the same time, this kind of rosy picture for Germany needs to be balanced against the observation that there's a certain disjuncture within the Biden administration between what has been described as the Asia people and the Europe people, which sometimes lack coordination. The balance between the two has so far tended to favor the Asia people, which were ready to go on day one, while the Europe team is only slowly taking shape. And this imbalance can be seen, for example, in the National Security Council. Now, what this suggests is that US-German relations in the coming years will partly be shaped by how Germany will be able to use the access it has to the Biden administration and how the relationship between Team Asia and Team Europe in the Biden administration will develop. My third point is that there was universal agreement among interviewees that the Biden administration has quite an optimistic outlook on the new German government. The general expectation being that the traffic light coalition will be better aligned with the Biden administration's priorities than the previous government and less wedded to some of the legacy thinking of the Merkel governments, for example, on China. Olaf Scholz personally is seen as a solid pragmatist in the Biden administration. He's of course well known from his previous role as a finance minister, and he is seen to embody a kind of a good mix between reassuring continuity and prospect for change. I heard more concerns about his party, the SPD. There's uncertainty where the party stands on Russia and China. Interviewees referred to what they called loose cannons and intra-party divides in the SPD, for example, on NATO and nuclear sharing. But ultimately, the view is that Olaf Scholz as chancellor will be able to ensure that more radical ideas from within his party will not affect German foreign policy. What also came out of the interviews is that much of the optimism in the Biden administration is pinned on the Greens, not least because they are seen to take the hardest line on China and Russia. There is some concern, however, about to what extent the Greens will be prepared to follow up on their strong rhetoric on China and Russia. And there is doubt about whether the Greens will actually be able to leave a strong mark on coalition foreign policy and whether they will be able to claw back some of the big ticket foreign policy items that have increasingly been dealt with in the chancellery under the Merkel government. I heard less on the FDP. They are seen as dedicated Atlanticists, but the overall impression is that they have lost some of its traditional interest in foreign policy and will not be so central to coalition foreign policy. There was some concern that the FDP emphasis on fiscal discipline, in particular with them holding the finance ministry, may kind of disappoint hopes in the Biden team that the new German government will be able to bring in somewhat more expansionist fiscal policies. So quite favorable views of the traffic light coalition overall. But my final general point is that this comes with a clear expectation in the Biden administration that Germany steps up on the international stage and that it adapts its foreign policy outlook to a changing geopolitical environment. Now, what that exactly means depends on the specific issues, but the key source of US-German friction has been that while US foreign policy thinking starts out from the assumption that we live, as one interviewee put it, in an age of disruption, there has been some frustration in DC that the previous German government was kind of reluctant to see that change is happening. And on the most general level, the expectation is that the Biden administration is that the traffic light coalition will adopt a different mindset. So how does this play out for different issues on the transatlantic agenda? And the only place to begin really is China, which is of course the top foreign policy priority of the Biden administration. It is one of the rare points of bipartisan agreement in the US that China is the major long-term strategic adversary. And it's also no secret that China ranks at the top of the list of US disappointments with the previous German government, including Angela Merkel personally. And the complaints are, broadly speaking, that Germany has been too soft on China, prioritizes economic interests, and failing to appreciate the extent to which China poses a fundamental challenge to the liberal international order. Now, while there's recognition that the German approach to China has started to change, the number one expectation of the new coalition in the Biden team is that it takes a more strategic approach to China and that it comes out more clearly in support of the US agenda on China. This also suggests that if the Scholz government will be able to show that it can deliver on China, it may actually be able to cut some slack with the Biden administration on other issues. China was, of course, front and center of many of my interviewees, and I don't have the space to talk about all the different dimensions of this issue. But I think it's possible to put what the Biden administration wishes to see from the traffic light coalition into three baskets. The first basket is about language. And here the Biden administration would like to see that Germany's rhetoric toughens up on issues such as human rights, values, democracy, but also Taiwan, Chinese meddling in Europe. The general sense is that the German discourse has been lagging behind the US discourse. But what is acknowledged in the Biden administration is that the German debate has been catching up, so that there is now quite close alignment in this regard. The coalition agreement, for example, talks about China as a systemic rival, takes a clear stance on Taiwan, calls out China for its human rights violations, and emphasizes the need for a coordinated transatlantic approach to China. So I think it's fair to say that this rhetoric basket is no longer very contentious in US-German relations. The second basket is about political signaling. So while nobody expects that Germany can make a significant military contribution in the Indo-Pacific, there is a strong expectation that Germany steps up in peacetime and sends strong political signals that affect Beijing's calculus of the political and economic costs of taking military action in the South China Sea, and that make it clear to China that it will not succeed in playing the transatlantic allies off against each other. An example of such a political signal that was positively received in the Biden administration was the deployment of the Bayern to the South China Sea. But at the same time, this signal was very much undermined by the decision to seek a port call in Shanghai, which has been described in my interviews as insane and embarrassing, and which was seen in the Biden administration as yet another example for the lack of strategic thinking about China in Germany, as yet another case of Germany's eagerness not to ruffle China's feathers. A related example where the Biden administration would like to see very strong signaling from the new German government is specifically about Taiwan. And here the expectation is that Germany plays a leading part in a coalition of allies to threaten China with punitive economic sanctions if it chooses to take military action against Taiwan, that Germany seeks closer diplomatic relations with Taiwan, and that it supports other European countries that have already done that. The third basket then is about trade and technology. So broadly speaking, the agenda of the new US-EU Trade and Technology Council. And it is here that Germany, given its economic weight, arguably matters most. This is a very high priority for the Biden administration. And this is where it places the highest value on a strong and positive German contribution and wants to see a less naive, more clear-eyed approach. In the past, Germany has often been seen as a problem in this field. A recent case in point being the Merkel government's attempt to push through with the EU-China investment agreement without consultation when the Biden administration was in transition. But there is a clear sense, again, that Germany's approach is changing. The German industry is also taking a less rosy view of China. What is very much appreciated, for example, is the tougher line Germany has adopted on investment screening. But what the Biden administration hopes to achieve is stronger cooperation with the new German government on a whole bundle of issues on the TTC agenda, from standard setting to supply chains to export controls. Now, the second issue that came out very prominently in the interviews is, of course, Russia. And in many ways, Russia was discussed along similar lines as China. Like with China, previous governments in Germany have been criticized for being too soft on Russia, for focusing too much on economic interests. But also like with China, Russia is an issue on which the Biden administration sees and welcomes a gradual shift in Germany's approach over the year, both in rhetoric and on the issue of sanctions, although one has to say that the coalition agreement does not toughen up the language on Russia as much as it does on China. Going forward, the Biden administration expectations converge on two main points. One, it wants Germany to become more engaged diplomatically, and not least in efforts to talk Putin out of military aggression in eastern Ukraine. And two, it wants Germany to be prepared to endorse increasingly muscular sanctions against Russia in order to deter Russian military action in eastern Ukraine or to punish Russia should such action happen. Now, what is easily the most controversial single issue between the US and Germany in relation to Russia is, of course, Nord Stream 2, on which the coalition agreement is suspiciously silent. The Biden administration has, of course, waived sanctions against companies involved in the project as part of this general outreach to Germany, and it continues to pay a domestic political price for that. And in the meantime, of course, the pipeline has been completed. But there was a strong consensus among interviewees that the issue remains an important touchstone for the Scholz government's approach to Russia and a possible irritant in US-German relations. Most interviewees were highly critical of the Biden decision to waive the sanctions for a range of different reasons, because it sends the wrong signal to Putin, because it overlooks security interests of Central and Eastern European states, because it undercuts voices in Germany that have opposed the pipeline, and because the waiver has been seen as making concessions to Germany without getting anything tangible in return. Other interviewees were less critical and described the agreement as making the best out of a bad hand. But what is more important for my project really is that there was a strong view among interviewees that the ball is now in Germany's court, and that the big test for the new government will be whether it lives up to the letter and spirit of the agreement, of the US-German agreement. And specifically what the Biden administration expects is that the traffic light coalition follows up on its pledge to respond if Russia weaponizes energy or engages in aggressive action against Ukraine. And Russia's current behavior on Ukraine's border is clearly putting this pledge to the test. And the Biden administration, and in particular Congress, will be interested to see where the red lines for the new German government actually are. Now, the third area that came out as a high priority for the Biden administration is Germany's role in Europe and the future EU trajectory. And let me just single out the two foremost expectations the Biden administration has in this field. The first is that Germany should use its leverage in the EU to lead in Europe and keep the EU together. The Biden administration sees the EU as an important international actor, takes an unusually pro-EU position, wants to see a strong EU, and believes that Germany is essential for this. And the view is that the new German government should become more proactive, lead more from the front to engage the EU more in its neighborhood. The Western Balkans came up a lot, Ukraine, of course, but also Belarus and sometimes North Africa. And Germany should do more to counter democratic backsliding within the EU, specifically in some of its Central and Eastern European members. In other words, the Biden administration wants a stronger division of labor in which the EU, led by Germany, takes on more responsibilities in Europe and its neighborhood, so that the US can focus its resources more on the strategic rivalry with China. Now, this seems to tie in, at least on a rhetorical level, with the very strongly pro-EU coalition agreement, in which the coalition partners commit to use Germany's special responsibility, quote unquote, in Europe in the interest of the EU as a whole, and to work towards a stronger role of the EU in international affairs. This directly speaks to the second point, which is that the Biden administration takes quite a different approach to the idea of European strategic autonomy than previous administrations, in that it is not opposed to the idea in principle, but wants to see what it means in practice, what it can deliver for transatlantic security. And here Germany comes in. The Biden administration wants the Scholz government to really lean into this debate rather than remain on the sidelines and to direct the idea away from French designs and to focus it more on the security concerns of the Central and Eastern European states. And if that succeeds, European strategic autonomy may actually contribute to the division of labor the Biden administration wants to see. And again, this theme resonates with the coalition agreement, which talks about Europe's strategic sovereignty, quote unquote, that needs to be strengthened, but not in competition with NATO. And that brings me to the final priority area, NATO and defense. And let me go straight into, again, the two most notable issues here, defense spending and nuclear sharing. On defense spending, the Biden administration appreciates the increases in German defense spending over recent years and expects that this continues. But the sense is that this issue is less of a make or break issue for the Biden administration than it was for the Trump administration. In particular, the view seems to be gaining ground in the Biden administration that one should take a more holistic view on burden sharing, and then that one should be more flexible in the interpretation of what counts towards 2% target. Now, this idea is very much criticized on the Republican side of the debate, but it aligns with the case Germany has been making for a long time. And it creates an opening for the traffic light coalition, two partners of which have been openly critical of the 2% target. And in this context, it's interesting to see that the coalition agreement does not explicitly mention this target at all, but rather loosely talks about honoring Germany's commitments in NATO and brings in a more broadly defined target of spending 3% of GDP on international affairs, but including not only defense spending, but also diplomacy and development aid. So you can easily see how this may lead over time to a watering down of the NATO spending pledges. And the second NATO-related issue is nuclear sharing. And this came up in the context of some voices in the SPD during the election campaign, which questioned Germany's participation in this arrangement. And the angle in the interviews was that this was noted in the Biden administration, that it was not helpful in inspiring confidence in the SPD, but that ultimately nobody in DC believed that any German government would unilaterally pull Germany out of nuclear sharing. And the litmus test for the Biden administration was that it wanted to see a clear commitment of the new government to replace the old Tornadoes with nuclear-capable aircraft. And this is what the coalition agreement seems to deliver when the coalition pledges to decide on the procurement of a new generation of fighter jets early on in its term in office in light of nuclear sharing requirements. So let me wrap up with saying that my findings seem to confirm that on a programmatic level and in terms of the overall orientation and predispositions of the governments in Washington and Berlin, the prospects for close US-German relations look better than for quite some time. We see growing alignment, or at least the contours of how the two sides can come together on a range of issues, including China, even though possible spoilers obviously remain, for example, Nord Stream 2. But in closing, I think it's important to note with Donald Rumsfeld 3 known unknowns that may easily get in the way. Coming back to what I said at the beginning, the first is domestic politics on both sides of the Atlantic, but perhaps in particular in the US. And it's easy to see how domestic political dynamics can work to undo US-German alignment, undercut US-German cooperation. Second, we will need to see how the traffic light coalition operates in office, who will be in charge of the key foreign policy portfolios, how will the coalition dynamics play out, how will the obvious tensions between the coalition partners be resolved? And finally, it's more likely than not that US-German relations will be tested in the coming years by major international ruptures or crises, for example, Ukraine or Taiwan. And it is an open question at this stage how resilient the current transatlantic convergence on a range of international issues will be under such circumstances. So I leave it at that and look forward to comments and questions.
Well, thank you, Kai, for an extremely comprehensive and detailed presentation of the major issues in the German-American relationship. I thought that was really great. And I've got one question that I'll start with while I give others who are in the audience an opportunity to formulate their questions to you. And that is, you've been focused, of course, in your research here on American views of the German-American relationship. So I'm going to, ask a question that is about the results of your interviews and research do you find among Americans any divergence from what has been sort of a standard decades-long assumption of a high degree of unanimity or overlap in German and American interests? Do you find in your interviews, of course, it's no secret that in the previous administration, President Trump was very critical of Germany in specific, and often most of his criticisms of Europe found a German nexus. Do you see evidence that that has taken hold and that view is shared? To what degree do you note the doubts among American foreign policy thinkers about the convergence of interests of the United States and Germany?
Yeah, many thanks, Jeff. I think you can see and perhaps greater appreciation than perhaps 10 years ago that interests in Germany are not necessarily aligned with interests in the US. For example, on China and Russia, I think interviewees were making the point that the analysis on some of these issues is quite similar to the Trump administration in that there is acknowledgement that, for example, on Russia, German geopolitical position and economic interests, kind of suggest that Germany should have different priorities. On China, it is acknowledged that strong economic relationship between Germany and China will lead Germany to have different preferences and interests. I think the key difference is that there is some understanding for that in the Biden administration, and the approach is more, rather than to always kind of very much criticize Germany for that, but work on the basis of an understanding of a lack of kind of natural convergence to tease out or to try to find compromise and consensus on that basis on more strategic issues. So, for example, on China, this thing about China as a partner, competitor, and systemic rival, I think that is very much something that even partly came from Europe to the US and then back to Europe. So I think that's one example that nobody, I mean, the Biden administration is saying, well, we are not asking Germany to choose between the US and China, although some interviews said that actually at one point you have to choose, but that's one thing. But rather that there can be these multifaceted relationships with China or on Russia. Definitely there is acknowledgement that interests can diverge and do diverge, but then the expectation is that on the more strategic level, one has to find a common ground. And I think in terms of one thing that often came up is that the US is trying, or the Biden administration has come to a more clear-eyed assessment of what allies can actually contribute. And clearly there are some things, given Germany's capabilities or lack thereof, and preferences, some things that Germany will unlikely be able to deliver, but then it's perhaps not very good policy to always kind of push Germany in that direction, but rather on issues where Germany can be very important and where it will be important to find common ground.
Okay, thank you. We have one question from our viewers, one of our viewers, and that is about the economic dimension of the China issue. And the questioner notes that BMW has recently made a decision to move some of its production from the United States to China. Previously, a large part of the BMW sales in China were actually cars produced in the United States and then exported to China. Now with the trade tensions and retaliation between the United States and China, it seems that BMW is trying to relocate at least some of its production. Were those kinds of investment decisions that have a transatlantic element, essentially the shifting of a German footprint in the United States to a German footprint, a stronger German footprint in China, did those come up in your interviews? And did you hear your particular perspectives? Was that a consideration for the American policy officials you were talking to?
Now, this particular issue did not. In general, the sense was that the kind of the high tide of ever more engagement of German companies in China, that this high tide may have passed, and that, for example, the BDI, so the Association of German Industry, so basically the point was that in the past, German foreign policy may have been pushed by the BDI and other economic interests in a very in a direction that prioritizes these economic interests and that perhaps underplays the more strategic concerns. But the point that was repeatedly made is that it's not really that the new government will have to go against these economic interests as much as these economic interests themselves are beginning to change. Seeing more and more the problems that are related or that come out of these investments in China. So the BMW example is a good counterexample, but I think in general, the overall perception and assessment of interviewers was, well, hang on a minute, German industry is coming ever more on board. So therefore, and that was part of the explanation why people expect also a change in Germany's approach to China.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and I think there you see on the German side, just a personal comment that, you know, there is a change, and you pointed to the BDI as the best example of that. But there is also a diversity of views within German industry, and I think the BMW example may highlight some of that. We have a question about some of the non-security issues, and did issues like climate change, migration, global inequality, did those come up in your research? Do American counterparts see Germany as a factor, a contributor to addressing those issues alongside the United States?
Yeah, thank you for this question. And yes, they did come up, and I just focused on, well, I tried to focus on the issues that came up most, and that were also kind of traditionally seen as problem areas, to make my point that perhaps we see some alignment on some of these issues. So migration did not come up. Climate change came up a lot as well. And there the sense was that there will be many opportunities for cooperation, in particular now, of course, with the Greens in office, that there was the point or the perception was that there will be broad alignment between the Biden administration's views and the new German government's views. There were examples that were discussed as kind of precedents for cooperation going forward. And one area that was singled out by many was this idea of linking the trade and the climate change agendas, dirty steel, and also the strategic agenda with China. So that was pointed out as a possibility for further cooperation. And the key problem or obstacle that was discussed again was domestic politics, in this case really in the US, in that people pointed out that the Biden administration, the question is how will it be able to deliver on these things, given that much of what is under discussion requires domestic legislation. The question, of course, is how much of that will Biden team get through Congress. So that was one point where people said, look, a lot of alignment on paper. The question is going forward, how much of that will actually then lead to practical cooperation. On global inequality, yes, again, there was, this did come up, also in this context of Build Back Better world. Overall, the idea was that Germany is a kind of a leader in this area, that Germany, that the Biden administration very much, or there's again a lot of alignment in this area. But in this case, the problem with investment in general on the international level and with investment also in the developing world, the problem here was again this thing about the FDP and the question of how much money will the new German government actually take into its hands to support initiatives like that.
Okay. We have a couple of additional questions, one which builds on some of these, and this is about sort of the soft power dimensions and especially the domestic developments in the United States and in Germany. Of course, in the United States, we had I think it's fair to say, a tumultuous transition or run up to the transition, and still, the American reckoning with the January 6th storming of the Capitol. It plays an enormous role in domestic politics here. And at the same time, we've observed a very, let's say, civil transfer of power. To what degree are those domestic factors weighing on not just on the potential for a shift in the midterm elections, but did you also see among your interviews elements of the domestic politics of each country playing a role, one on the other?
Okay. In a way, I was surprised to see how, according to the interviewees, how much understanding understanding and knowledge there is in the administration, broadly defined, of these kind of nuances in the German political debates. Yeah? So what the different parties are, what they stand for, even intra-party divides. I mean, people like Rolf Mützenich came up a lot, or Reinhard Bütikofer came up a lot. So people where I thought, oh, only insiders will even know.
They'll both be pleased to know that.
Yeah. So that's why I name checked them. So I was surprised by that in a way, but then interviewees also kind of made the point, well, hang on a minute, but that's more on the kind of expert level. Yeah. So that's not necessarily filtering through to the highest level of the government. Although, I mean, if you look at some of the papers that people who are now in the administration have written on the Green Party, for example, it's quite interesting for me to see how the level of detail. I think in Germany, the problem, I think that is what I tried to, the point I tried to make, that I think it would be useful to have a better understanding about how difficult the domestic political situation actually is in the US. I mean, in a way, I mean, we are used to transitions that are perhaps less smooth and less consensual than we are used to in Germany, but this is extraordinary. January 6th, I mean, clearly I knew that it was an important, or a very important date in the US, but the way interviewees talked about it as a watershed moment in US politics, I think this is underappreciated in Germany. And I therefore think that one important policy recommendation, if you like, is that German foreign policy makers should try to take into account more how what they do on some issues like Nord Stream 2 will play out in US domestic politics. I mean, that's not to say, of course, that Germany should not pursue its own interests, but they should always factor in, when they pursue their own interests, the repercussions that will have in the US. Because as I said, I think it's fair to say that from a German perspective, the current administration is kind of the best administration it can hope for. And therefore, like with Macron in France, perhaps it's kind of good foreign policy to try as much as possible and as much as it is in the German long-term interest to at least be not unhelpful with regards to some of the foreign policy for the middle class agenda of the Biden administration. I think, well, my impression is that is underappreciated. And some of my interviews, I mean, they were really scathing about German strategic thinking, the ability to think strategically about foreign policy. I mean, perhaps that is a particular US perspective, but I could relate to some of the arguments.
Thanks. We have a question here about the foreign economic policy issues. is cooperation on things like international corporate taxation, the onshoring of supply chains, or the setting of regulatory standards for either big tech or for future technological developments, an issue on the minds of the people you interviewed, or do security concerns and some of the, let's say, more traditional foreign policy issues dominate their thinking?
No, that was very much on the mind of interviewees. I mean, I tried to have a broad spectrum of interviewees. I mean, clearly some were very much focused on traditional security issues, but I deliberately tried to get on board trade experts. And on China, my third basket was specifically about these issues, trade and technology. Clearly, that has the highest priority for the Biden administration in terms of specifically the expectations of Germany. And I think, again, as a policy recommendation, it would be good politics from the German side to understand that, because that is really where Germany can cut some slack with the Biden administration and be seen as a reliable ally on China. And this is also, I think, an area where you see very clear convergence. I mean, corporate taxation with the new government is an obvious example. Onshoring of supply chains is also something that is, I think, high on the agenda in Germany. Investment screening, I think, many in the US appreciate how much that Germany takes tougher line on that and has changed course. So indeed, in particular, the interviewers who take a more general perspective, who are neither trade experts nor security experts, we're often making that point that, look, the transatlantic agenda has shifted, in particular in US-German relations, because, as I said, everybody understands that, regrets perhaps, but understands that Germany cannot really make a useful or very meaningful military contributions in the Indo-Pacific. But the transatlantic agenda has changed to issues where Germany is more important and can make more of a difference, which kind of enhances the importance of the relationship, but also gives or puts the government under pressure, if you like, to deliver, but also opens up opportunities for Germany to show its worth as a transatlantic ally and perhaps compensate weaknesses in other areas.
Thanks. There is sometimes a dynamic in transatlantic discussion, and especially between Germany and the United States, that is in the mode or the framework of expectations and obligations. And you see this on the American side because the United States is accustomed to playing a leadership role in NATO, in the transatlantic alliance, and globally. But you also see it in the German foreign policy discussion, which is often very strongly focused around the expectations of Germany's partners. What does Germany need to do in the European Union, for example, to keep it together, or what does it need to do in the transatlantic relationship in order to satisfy Washington? And against that backdrop, question from the one viewer, which is, how far can shared narratives on China, on climate, on human rights, improve the German-American relationship in an enduring way? Or is there a point at which diverging national interests disrupt that?
Well, thank you very much. That's a question very close to my heart, actually, and also a very, very good observation, because I think the project was driven by this observation, this point, this argument that Germany is unusual. German foreign policy is unusual in how other focused German foreign policy is, because the expectations of others, in particular the US and the European allies, but also Israel, for example, are extremely strongly entwined with German identity. I mean, more than I guess in many other countries. So these are very important things in Germany to be seen, to live up expectations of these very close Western allies. Shared narratives, I would go even further to say that German national interests, I think you can't say there are narratives on one hand and interests, diverging interests on the other hand, but rather interests are being constructed and defined through these narratives. And yes, I absolutely agree. I mean, there are divergences. There are always divergences and differences. But if one would be able to develop shared narratives, for example, on China, that could lead to a definition of German interests that may or that will support and consolidate transatlantic partnership. So I wouldn't put these two in competition to each other, narratives and interests, but rather I would say that narratives are extremely important in the construction of these interests, and in also then how these interests are being communicated domestically and internationally. And the external expectations on German foreign policy are really critical, I think, for these narratives that are being developed in Germany as well. And if I may say so, more under the Biden administration than under the Trump administration. Because from the German perspective, it was quite obvious that the Trump administration was not interested in developing shared narratives. And that was even in Germany, a point where Angela Merkel was able to say, look, the times are over when we were able to completely rely on others, I think she said. And then there was a kind of a reorientation, if you like, of German policy, foreign policy discourse to Europe, a strengthening of the Franco-German partnership. Yeah, but I think this is different now under the Biden administration, where decision makers in Germany see scope again for living up to the expectations and for developing shared narratives that hold the two, or that bring the two together again.
Very good, thanks. You have alluded to or you've addressed the fact that in a three-party coalition, there is that's a source of uncertainty and contestation between different views. And I want to go a level deeper with one question we've gotten here, which is, how does the Biden administration, from your research, expect the influence of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Annalena Baerbock from the Green Party, to be, especially in relation to that of Chancellor Olaf Scholz, when it comes to the main transatlantic issues which you've outlined? What are expectations of how that dynamic will develop?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think, again, an excellent question. I think the overall impression, or the overall impression I got, and the expectation that was formulated, is that the big ticket items will probably be dealt with within the Chancellery. So Europe, EU, I mean, the Europe department is in the Chancellery, China, Russia. So therefore, there was kind of, although people or the administration seems to pin a lot of its expectations or hope on the Greens, looking at the close alignment between Green positions on China and Russia with the Biden administration's perspective, there's a certain disjuncture here in that they pin much of their optimism on that, but at the same time expect at the end of the day Chancellor Scholz to call all the shots. But I personally would be a bit more cautious here, because I think that's an expectation that is just path dependency, or relies just on path dependency. Basically, what we observed under Merkel, our likelihood is that will also happen under the next coalition government. I mean, that can be the case, but just 2 or 3 points. I mean, first of all, it's not what we always have in Germany. I mean, if you think back to Kohl-Genscher, that there was a different balance. Second, even under the Merkel government, I think that the Chancellery was taking on board ever more control, or taking ever more control of foreign policy portfolio developed over time. I mean, clearly Angela Merkel, 16 years in office with more than, well, 4 or so foreign ministers. Yeah. So clearly that implies a balance of influence that favors the Chancellor. And I'm not so sure that continues under the next coalition government. If you look at early moves from Baerbock, I think that seems to suggest that she is clearly very, very interested and knows about the importance of trying to claw back some of this power and this influence to the Foreign Office. So one point in case is that she was able to get the responsibility for international climate negotiations into the Foreign Office. And the second, I think just today, that she changed her junior minister in the Foreign Office from, I even wrote down the name, Miguel Berger, who is very close to the SPD, to Andreas Michaelis, who was the predecessor of Berger in that role, and currently is Germany's ambassador to the UK and a member of the Green Party. So I think clearly she tries to reassert some control or assert some control on foreign policy. So that I would say it's still in the, I wouldn't automatically expect that the division of labor and the balance of influence will just be the same as it was under the Merkel government. I mean, Scholz does not yet have that authority, and I think Baerbock is a different foreign minister than Heiko Maas. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And we've got just a few minutes left, and I want to take two questions, one from the audience and one of my own. So in your, from the audience, the question is whether issues of regional security and dealing with questions such as Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran, etc., have arisen as areas in which the United States has a particular interest in the German role.
Yes, yes. This was an issue, but mainly in the context, well, less Iraq. I mean, Iran, obviously, I mean, I didn't touch on that because basically the point was, look, there's now alignment, full alignment between the Biden administration and the new government on the Iran nuclear deal. So this was an issue, but was never seen as a problem. But in terms of regional security, more narrowly defined, the issue came up, but in this context of division of labor. Yeah, so Germany is expected to use its influence in the EU to develop EU strategic autonomy, difficult concept, I know, but to develop that in a way that that Europe, sorry, can contribute to regional stability, and not only along the lines of French interests, which would focus the EU perhaps more in a particular direction, let's say, than the US would want. Turkey did come up once or twice, but more in this kind of overall perspective of Germany, given the close relations they have with Turkey, that they should use their influence more. That was not defined more specifically. Their domestic or their access to the Erdogan government to kind of insist on certain values and democracy or human rights, but that was never spelled out in any detail.
All right, one viewer got a question in under the as the door was closing. Any specific projects or initiatives to enhance the transatlantic relationship that we can expect? I think this is expect from the American side. It seems to me.
Well, it's a difficult one at the end. I mean, I think under the outgoing Merkel government, there was this agreement with the Biden administration. I can't think of the label they put onto that, of a German-US, don't know, did they call it a council or an agenda for
Futures Forum was the phrase.
Yeah, Futures Forum. Thank you, Jeff. Exactly. So that is seen or was discussed as a very hopeful, a very positive signal that even the outgoing government was trying to, also from the German side, to reciprocate Biden administration's outreach. So I think this would be something that needs to be filled with content. And on the other, I mean, the specific areas of cooperation, I think, will be on the trade and technology agenda. That's my guess and expectation. And I think there's a lot of specific things happening. And just last point, I mean, one or two interviews talked about subnational cooperation going on in these areas. And I was interested to hear how much is happening there, which is perhaps a bit under the radar.
Okay. And from me, if you had to think about one thing that could go wrong in the early days of the Scholz government, and we're still relatively early days of the Biden administration, I guess, almost 1 year in. But if you could think of one thing that has the potential to be a serious source of friction that could confront the German and American governments in the next couple of months, any guesses?
Yeah, unfortunately, a very clear guess, and that is Nord Stream 2. I mean, just imagine what happens. I mean, Putin is testing this out. Just imagine, given the divergence, I mean, that's an area of clear divergence between the SPD, say, and both other coalition partners. What if the SPD wins the argument in Germany, and at the end of the day, Germany is kind of not living up to the pledges it's made under the US-German relations? Think about Congress, what Congress will do, even if Biden administration would perhaps even have some sort of understanding, they will come under so much domestic pressure that the thing will really blow off and go, you know, into a crisis mode. So I think this is my main concern in the short term, because all the other things are more longer term, I believe. But this could go wrong in the short term.
Okay. Well, Kai, you have taken us on a tour around the world to some of the most important aspects of the German-American relationship and US cooperation with Europe under a new German government and under the Biden administration. So I want to thank you for that. This has been an excellent conversation. And I also want to offer thanks at the end to a few very important institutions and individuals. The first is the German Academic Exchange Service, the DAAD, which funds our visiting fellowship program, and with which we've had such a productive relationship for so many years, for which we're very grateful. The second is to Susanna Dieper and to Liz Hoteri on the AICGS staff, who are working with our visiting fellows and producing these seminars, as well as publishing their written contributions. So be on the lookout, everyone, for Kai's written product, which will be coming out soon, along with that of all of our other visiting fellows on a variety of topics. So Kai, thanks so much for being with us today and this fall, and wish you all the best.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, and best regards to everyone out there for a joyous and peaceful holiday season. And we will look forward to seeing you at public events early next year. And all the best to all of you. Bye-bye.